and a warm welcome to the latest edition of Conversations in Drug Development, brought to you by the team at Boyd's. This podcast is for our fellow community of scientists and clinicians working in the wonderful world of cell and gene therapy and drug development. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Conversations in Drug Development. My name is Katherine Bowen. I'm the Chief Regulatory Affairs Officer at Boyd's, and I'm delighted to be joined from the other side of the Atlantic today by Eric Hardter from our US office. Hello, Eric.
Hi, Katherine. How are things over there 5 hours in the future?
5 hours in the future, hot, I think is probably a reasonable summary of how things are over here. How are things over there in America?
Hot, I think, is both literal and metaphorical in this scenario based on what we're about to discuss.
That may take us on to our topic for today, because actually it's not that long since you and I got together with Harriet to do our predictions for 2025. But so much seems to have happened just in the short few months since we did that podcast that actually we thought it might be worth us doing another update on what is happening in the US regulatory environment. It's hard to believe that version 2 of the Trump administration it's only since January. Are we even 6 months in, Eric?
Yeah, thereabouts, only since January. And like you said, we released the Crystal Ball podcast in March of this year. I don't know if it's similar for you, but time has kind of lost all meaning. There has been a lot that's been happening, especially in the world of the US FDA, which of course is why we're discussing this here today.
Yep, indeed. And I think it's fair to say that some of this is still in its infancy. So although we like to get out our crystal ball again, I think this is more going to be an update episode. We can't necessarily look that directly into the future and know how all of this is going to pan out. But there has been so much happening. I think it would have been remiss of us not to comment on at least some elements. So trying to think where's best to start. I mean, perhaps if we start at the top and talk about who is indeed at the top and the various staffing changes that we've seen at the FDA, because there's been some pretty significant ones since we last spoke.
Yeah, and none of this is surprising. We have a new presidential administration. We have a new Congress. They like to bring in their own people. So again, this is something that we knew coming in, and especially with the Department of Health and Human Services, because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wound up supporting President Trump during his campaign. He wound up getting kind of that kickback of being in charge of HHS, which was something that he was fairly passionate about. And with that, he's begun to bring his own people again into the FDA as well. And so I think, yeah, that's a good place to start. I think we've had a lot of movement. We have a new FDA commissioner. Marty McCary was installed in March, actually right around the time we did the Crystal Ball podcast. And with that has come a lot of additional change. Do you want to maybe start with CBER? There's been some
let's start
movement.
with CBER. So Peter Marks has gone.
Yeah, and this is not one of those breakups, I think, where everyone says, but we're still friends. Unfortunately, there was a little bit of public acrimony. Folks can use Google to their heart's desire. I think there was some mistrust between Marks and Kennedy. They just were not on the same page at the end of the day. And in addition to that, actually more recently, Nicole Verdun, the director of the Office of Therapeutic Products at CBER, I don't know what the appropriate term is. They use administrative leave. In any event, she's no longer there. To my knowledge, the position has not yet been backfilled, so we are waiting for some information there. But these were two pioneers in cell and gene therapies, right?
Yep, absolutely. And I would like to say we're recording this episode on the 30th of June, 2025. And I say that because it is perfectly possible by the time some of our listeners listen to this that the situation may have changed again. But you're right. And we have lost pioneers. Do you want to maybe just, I know you're an expert on this, talk us through some of the things that we are potentially losing as Peter Marks and Nicole Verdun are leaving us?
Yeah, and again, I'm just going to use that word pioneer because under their watch and excluding some of the cord blood drug products, they had 34 cell and gene therapies approved.
Is it that many?
Yeah, and as we know, this is what happens with time. I guess I'll use maybe a good recent example is the CRISPR-Cas9 technology, where it was very kind of shrouded in mystery, and now suddenly we have an approval and it's become a bit more commonplace. I feel like that's what Marx and Verdun did, but with this overarching sense from the totality of cell and gene therapies. They took something that was very poorly understood, and they have quite simply gotten medicines to patients. And when it's cell and gene therapies, these are often rare diseases and folks who don't have any other options. So it's really a shame to lose their pioneering perspectives. They also were key cogs in Operation Warp Speed with the COVID vaccines. Again, just very forward thinking. So we can't predict the future with what that's going to hold when we have some new folks. And then we're going to discuss another one in Vinay Prasad, who is now the CBER director. But that, I think, is what we're losing.
Okay. And I agree. I mean, Harriet and I have mentioned this before, that we were lucky enough to interview Peter Marks. Oh God, it was probably about this sort of time last year. And it was very clear that his innovative thinking was still at the forefront. So let's talk a little bit about Vinay Prasad and what we know about him. So medical doctor, hematologist, oncologist. So we're talking somebody with some relevant knowledge and know-how here. What else do we know about him, Eric?
Yeah, and I'll say this is my term that I'm using for him, and just kind of looking across the internet. He was, prior to joining the government, almost something of like a social media influencer. He's all over the internet, Twitter, YouTube channel, podcast, his own website, multiple books. And like you said, he's got the classical training and background for someone befitting this position, but he also was definitely in contrast with a lot of what the prior administration's scientific positions were, particularly on the COVID vaccine. He's a bit of a skeptic there, particularly in the pediatric population. And then I think more importantly, he was actually just at direct odds with the way that Marx handled CBER. He viewed them, these are his words, as a rubber stamp for approvals, and that he quote unquote lowered the bar for gene therapies. So I know you and I just talked about using words like pioneering, getting these 34 cell and gene therapies. Prasad seems to maybe think these came about, their approvals, a little too easily. Not having any government experience, this isn't actually new to the Trump administration. It was the case in his first administration. It is again here. He likes to kind of upset the apple cart a little bit. He likes to challenge the status quo. And I think Prasad is going to be one of those disruptor type people.
And I guess the question that's going to really matter for our listeners, for people who are developing in that space, is what's this really going to mean for the development of their products and acceptability of their products to the FDA, accepting that, of course, you are devoid of an actual crystal ball, Eric.
Yeah, and again, this is sort of just us reading between the lines a little bit. I'll start with one of the most recent CBER gene therapy approvals of Elevidys that was actually approved on a surrogate endpoint, classically an oncology paradigm. So again, sort of that forward-thinking approach by Marx and Verdun. If you take Prasad at his word, it kind of seems that he is not a believer in surrogate endpoints. He's not a believer in looking at analyses that maybe they failed the primary endpoint, but there might be a subset of population. And again, this was sort of the case with Elevidys as well, that the approval could be relevant for. So it does seem like he's going to be a bit more discretionary. We might not see any more accelerated approvals in the cell and gene therapy space, no more surrogate endpoints. And then also, because he seems to believe that more evidence is required for approval of cell and gene therapies, what might a pivotal trial look like? Will you need more patients? What might your integrated analyses of safety and efficacy look like? And of course, when we look at that, we think of two things: time and money. This is time and money that developers are going to spend on producing these potentially life-saving drugs. And when we look at like the rare disease population, even with the knowledge that there could be some orphan drug designation benefits, again, this is maybe like a conservative worst case scenario, but do they just throw their hands up in the air and say, is this really worth developing at this point?
And we've seen some initial fallout from this, right, already. I mean, we've noticed that the smaller companies don't seem to be getting as much funding through the door. Decision making seems to have slowed somewhat. It's very difficult to say exactly how much of that correlates to what. But that's certainly been my experience of this over the past couple of months, Eric.
Yeah, and I will say the pendulum swings very rapidly with the fallout of some of the decision making of the Trump administration. Even right now, they're trying to push the big, beautiful bill through Congress that has potential to, again, have some more far reaching changes, not even just in the realm of FDA and regulatory affairs. But initially, there was definitely a lot of market backlash. Some of the stocks for some of the companies, the small cell and gene therapy developers, vaccine developers, shot down pretty intensely initially, I would say. I don't know if it's sort of started to round back into the form. The stock market as a whole in the US has kind of rounded back into the form since that date. So I don't know if this is going to be a symptom of a larger market paradigm or if there's still going to be some kind of micro movement. But yeah, to your point, the funding was getting diminished. And again, we did see that initial backlash.
Yeah, and of course there's some fairly serious implications for NIH funding in that big beautiful bill as well, potentially. That's in the Senate, I believe, at this point.
Yeah, the NIH is still rumored to have this massive organizational change. I think it's going to consolidate a lot of the institutes into I don't have the exact number, but a series of smaller institutes. With that, there could be additional reductions in force, which is very unfortunate. I've done a lot of work with the researchers at NIH, and they're just some of the top folks in their field from scientific and medical perspective, really just, as we all are, I think, interested in getting medicines to patients.
Mm-hmm.
And CDC, similar, FDA, again, we've talked about that a little bit. We'll talk about it a little bit more with these reductions in force. And then even some of the funding drying up to some of the higher tier academic institutions in the States as well. Harvard is, I think, the classical example there, that they had almost all their federal funding removed. So their biotech and all of the types of groundbreaking science they were doing is at least sort of temporarily halted in some of these things. I know I'm getting a little bit off scope here, but I do think it all ties together. At the end of the day, it's all going to tie towards what does the translational science look like that's going to push forward these medicines.
And in regulatory terms, these are the uncertainties, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to people again for a moment. So Marty Makary was at Bio a couple of weeks ago, making a lot of public statements, sounding actually in many ways very reasonable. An awful lot of what he was saying, I don't think many of us would disagree with. So again, what do we know? What might our expectations be around how he may now continue to shape the FDA?
And it's interesting because I mentioned earlier about some of the types of people who wind up filling cabinet positions or government positions under the Trump administration. What you'll see sometimes is folks kind of shoehorning their prior beliefs into the Trump framework of belief. Makary hasn't done that. He's basically stuck to what he has said previously. As one example, he was actually very supportive of COVID vaccines, initially of the lockdowns. Since then, I think he's maybe become a little bit more critical, but that was more about the federal mandates, not the science behind the COVID vaccines and the science behind lockdowns, masking, et cetera. He does believe, and I think this is sort of in line with some of what we're going to talk about today, in him trying to push the boundaries a little bit. He felt there was just too much regulatory red tape. Again, this is a broad scale hallmark of the Trump administration. They use the phrase, I think it's deconstructing the administrative state, is one that's used very often. And from an FDA perspective, what does this mean? Is this going to roll out faster approvals, et cetera? And I think to use a phrase, he's talked the talk, right? A lot of what we're going to discuss today is kind of that press release type of vibe. It doesn't have the meat on it just yet, but you have to start somewhere. Mm-hmm. And I would prefer someone who at least comes out and says the forward-thinking things as opposed to being silent or looking to take things backwards.
Yeah, I agree. And as I say, I mean, an awful lot of what he was saying at Bio the other week about trying to make things more efficient, but actually trying to speed up approvals where we could, trying to shorten that gap for when patients actually get a medicine and receive benefit from it. I don't think any of us would necessarily argue with those principles, but you can't change something as big as the FDA overnight. Necessarily, we are really going to be at the press release level at this time. It's going to be interesting to see how it pans out in reality.
And I think the only other thing I would say too, and it's almost like an unspoken question, or at least one that hasn't been answered yet. You mentioned Bio, where CEO Alan Boyd was there. He went to the fireside chat with Makary, and we talked about it as a Boyd's team. And my question sort of to him, but maybe just in general, was how does he fit with Prasad? Don't they seem to have kind of these completely opposing beliefs?
And it'll be interesting to see how in reality that actually pans out. And it won't be the first time that a major administration has had people with very different ideas. It's going to be who actually brings some of those to fruition. And presumably there are going to be points where there is crossover, right?
Yeah, and I mean, the concept of checks and balances exists for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody should not be thinking the same thing because that means no one's challenging one another. So I'm okay with it in a vacuum. I think that it will be interesting, like you said, to see how this might bear out in practice.
And of course, this isn't all happening in isolation. There was also a huge amount around the DOGE cuts, particularly earlier in the year. So we've heard a lot of speculation, I think, about what the impact will have been on the FDA. So what do we actually know about the cuts at the FDA level? And then we can talk about how we think in reality that might start to make a difference or not, as the case may be.
Yeah, as you said, Elon Musk was forced to reholster his chainsaw, at least for the time being. But while he was brandishing it, we know there were over 3,000 employees at FDA who unfortunately lost their positions due to the reduction in force. And then, of course, others in NIH, CDC, HHS, like we said. But what has happened when it moved so quickly and maybe not as discriminatory as it should have been, FDA has actually been hiring some of these folks back, and this has actually been a pan-government paradigm. They realized there were some folks who shouldn't have been let go. I think some examples were some of the scientific reviewers, some folks in Center for Devices. So there is a little bit of maybe extending that initial sentence with a comma, but so I think practically, though, it's hard to say. We're still in early days, so do we have some of these N of ones, as our statistician friends would say, or are we looking at canaries in the coal mine? We did see that within this month in June, FDA missed a PDUFA action date for an NDA. This was Calvista Pharma for hereditary angioedema. They, of course, are saying that it was no fault of theirs. This was on the FDA. We'll probably never know the full picture. All we're seeing are press releases from both parties. And then another one, Dare Bioscience, I think they had a special protocol assessment, and specifically FDA was going over a statistical analysis plan for their proposed pivotal trial and wound up, I guess, taking months longer than it should have. Here again, they were saying some of the same thing, that this is clearly due to the cuts that Elon Musk and crew made.
And maybe if we come to our own experience, people have asked me a few times what we've seen. And actually, I personally don't think I've seen that much of a difference, really. And we'd seen already a move towards written responses only for some procedures, particularly for pre-IND interactions. That predated all of this. We've had one pre-IND meeting where we were told to just file our IND. But we've not seen, I've certainly at least not seen big delays on any of the interactions that we've been having with the FDA up to this point. Have you seen anything yet, Eric, or have you heard any other rumours on the grapevine?
No, not really yet. And I think just taking a step back for folks who might not be completely familiar with the FDA process, drug developers spend a lot of money on applications for licensure. And with that, commitments from the FDA to time-bound certain types of submissions, INDs, formal meetings, applications for licensure. So that's kind of the agreement. And for me personally, I've not really seen it practically either. I actually have an IND under review right now with CBER, and the regulatory project manager has been fantastic, completely on the ball. I've had another open application with Center for Drugs, very similar. Regulatory project manager has been fantastic.
Yeah, been really good.
We'll have to see. It's still early days. We do know that there have been sort of some emboldened FDA employees on forums like LinkedIn kind of saying, all of this is great, right? But who's going to do the work? Because there are a lot of us. We're spread thin. I don't know. I don't know when and if we see the practical implications, but it does kind of seem like there could be a little bit of a storm brewing behind the scenes.
And if we go back to the conversations that were had at Bio the other week, and as you said, Alan Boyd was there and gave us a rundown on them. There was a lot about actually not impacting the review staff where they didn't need to, that this was about efficiencies in the kind of behind the scenes bureaucratic part, being efficient in terms of travel offices and IT infrastructure, etc. And I would just say I have worked in really big organizations, and I can tell you when your IT service desk changes, it doesn't matter how many people tell you you still got an IT service desk. It does have a knock-on effect on people's ability to be efficient, but how much of an effect it is really difficult to say, and how much in reality there have been changes at that reviewer level, particularly as those very senior and very respected people in CIBA go, will others go with them? And they kind of lose people anyway by osmosis, even if it wasn't part of the agreed cuts. And that's so incredibly difficult to predict for.
Yeah, and ultimately regulation, guidance, even FDA's own internal SOPs, policies and procedures are unchanged. So as far as we know, everything is operating in the same way that it has been operating even prior to the Trump administration 2.0.
FDA now have ELSA, I understand. So what do we know about ELSA?
What we know, well, first and foremost, I do not have any clever Frozen jokes planned, unfortunately, but hopefully our listeners can fill in the blanks here. This is another thing that was just, it's a press release, right? And press releases don't have a lot of meat on the bones. Again, it's good. It's not exactly novel. We talked about in the Crystal Ball podcast, everything is moving towards AI. And what they stated in this press release is, I think, what you would expect, what they would use AI. Reading, writing, and summarizing was the 10,000-foot overarching summation of what ELSA is doing. Some examples: accelerating review of clinical protocol, shortening time for scientific evaluations, identifying high priority inspection targets, summarizing adverse events. Importantly, I think what they've come out and said is that this is a totally insulated system. They're not taking any outside inputs. So I heard the term ELSA will not hallucinate. I don't know what that means. I guess she's not going to drift in her thinking and eventually take over the FDA. But all told, I guess this is just in line. It's great, but it's not different than I think what other global regulators have been doing for the past couple of years.
MHRA are talking publicly that they're starting to use AI for validation and for some elements of their reviews as well. And it makes sense, right? So long as it's done responsibly and reasonably, and you'd hope that is how regulators are using AI. If it can really make things more efficient for them, why would they not be using those tools?
Yeah, so I think for me, this is sort of a good to know, file it away. We'll see what happens.
Yep, totally agree. So let's talk then a little bit about some of the changes outside of the administration per se. So FDA did release some information around roadmaps for starting to reduce animal testing for preclinical safety studies. And I know there was a lot of excitement about this in the immediate aftermath of that press release. Certainly I saw an awful lot on LinkedIn hypothesizing about where this might go long term. So what do we actually know? What's the reality of the thinking on this, Eric?
Yeah, I think in today's U.S. Congress, very few things are bipartisan, but this one received substantial bipartisan approval. It actually had its origins a few years ago in version 2 of the FDA Modernization Act under the Biden administration. But after that, I think progress just kind of halted. Nothing really came from it until recently. I do think there was another push from Congress. They were actually about to release version 3.0 of the Modernization Act to kind of say, guys, why are we not acting on this? We approved this in 2022. Let's get a move on. So I don't know if this new framework was sort of a nod to that or just finally recognizing that we have a lot of new technology at our disposal. Let's use it. Let's not just assume we need to keep doing things the way that they've always been done.
Yeah, and I don't think this is actually all that new anywhere. I mean, this really aligns with the 3Rs concept, right, which has been discussed by regulators globally. EMA have been talking about this as well. And I think what was different here is that it felt as if it was a bit more specific than we'd seen previously. It was talking about perhaps starting with monoclonal antibodies. It actually had a tiny bit of meat starting to come around the bones. Granted, still not much. And I don't think this is animal testing goes away tomorrow, but at least it starts to give a framework for thinking about what other alternatives could be used into the future. And a good starting point perhaps to having those conversations with the FDA if there's a sensible way of doing this for a product.
Yeah, and FDA is using the acronym NAMS, which is short for New Approach Methodologies. But again, it's not really new. I think it's formalizing some of the approaches we already had. Organoids are the perfect example. We know those have been around for years now. AI-based computational models, ex vivo human tissue testing. Human microdosing is interesting. That's one that I think a lot of developers don't think of in terms of an IMP safety profile. As you said, they're starting with the monoclonal antibodies, but I think importantly, even having this roadmap in place, it is going to take time. This is not going to roll out tomorrow. We should not submit INDs tomorrow with no animal testing and just assume a rubber stamp from FDA.
Yeah, and I think in reality, you still need to be convincing regulators globally as well. This is the FDA's position, convincing regulators globally that the benefit risk is supportive for moving into testing in humans. So if it's not done in animals, there still has to be some scientifically based remit for having that conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And FDA is aware of this. They've said, again, we're rolling this out over the course of 5 years. We will be releasing guidance. We need to get some of these methodologies validated. It's going to start with a pilot program, as these things tend to do. So, again, change takes time, number one. And until that change fully gains traction, animal testing is still the gold standard. Let's not lose sight of that. This is what the expectation is going to be for at the time of an IND submission, giving that determination of an IMP's risk benefit profile.
Yep. But an interesting one to watch. We'll be keeping an eye out for any more specific guidance that comes along and anything from our own learnings. Okay, where should we go next? Should we talk about the National Priority Voucher Program?
I think we should. This is possibly the most recent one and possibly the most interesting as well, I'd say.
Should we save the best till last? So
Exactly.
what do we know then? So this was announced a couple of weeks ago, 18th of June. I saw it come out online and read it and went, huh. So somehow we're going to get the decision on NDAs, BLAs to 1 to 2 months instead of 10, which for those of us who've done a lot of filings seems on the face of it a somewhat unrealistic target, but I hate to be a naysayer. So what do we know about what products they'd be attempting to do this for and what the reality of that process might look like?
Yeah, and I think this was like a 2-minute video from Marty McCary that I saw on LinkedIn. I think he reinforced some of it at the bio conference as we discussed.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we're still in kind of the press release phase. One part of what he said did strike me, and it's just a very short quote: FDA must modernize. Must is a strong word, of course, but I'm here for it, right? I think we talked about this earlier. At the end of the day, we are drug development consultants, but what we really care about is getting patients access to medicines.
Getting medicines to patients who need it. Yep.
So if
Right
this
medicine,
is
right
going to help,
patient, right time. Yep.
exactly. So even if this is still in its infancy, it's, as I said earlier, it's better than the alternative of saying nothing or saying the opposite of that. So this is going to be a pilot program. Like you said, NDA and BLA submission decisions are going to come within 1 to 2 months instead of 10. But again, it's not really 1 to 2 months, right? It's 1 to 2 months after you submit that final clinical study data. And this sort of borrows from, I think, that rolling review paradigm that
Mm-hmm.
FDA already employs. However, with that, they have said following the submission of the last document, it would still take that 6 or 10 months, depending on whether you had priority review. This, of course, truncates that time.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because you know as well as I do, everyone assumes that confirmatory trials will be positive, but they are not always. So putting all of that work into writing up the and reviewing potentially the rest of that dossier, that's a big ask if you ultimately don't necessarily know if those clinical data are at the end of it going to be supportive of an approval, which is my piece here, I think. And one of the reasons why regulators often say they won't start reviewing everything in detail until those last pieces are in, although I suspect they take a sneaky peek. You would anyway, wouldn't you?
I mean, I would like to think so. I don't really have any like numbers in practice or anything like that, but you'd like to think, as you said, with the submission of maybe like 90% of your documents just prior to the final documents, that's getting a little bit of maybe like a pre-review or something like that, with the knowledge that, of course, we're all juggling a lot of different tasks. This is why we give ourselves X amount of days, weeks, months to get something done, because you're not always just going to be able to have a singular primary focus.
And so would this be open to anyone, Eric? And could any product go through this process? What do we know about what may or may not be eligible?
So the answer there, the short answer is no. One of the biggest differences between this and some of the other prior FDA initiatives is this is for US drug developers solely. And then there were a couple of buzz phrases that they used as they termed these as US priorities, such as manufacturing as a security issue, pandemic preparedness, or manufacturing for unmet needs. I don't really know what the first one means, to be honest with you. Manufacturing as a security issue. Maybe more will come out on that. I think pandemic preparedness and unmet needs are a little bit more straightforward. Maybe we'll learn something from who gets selected for the pilot program. That might help us out a little bit. But even FDA here again acknowledges that they need to add a lot of structure to this. They're going to roll out instructions, guidance, how to apply, more information on who's eligible. So we will be getting some of this information in the future.
Yeah, and from years of creating documents for special designations for different forms of filing, I can tell you that definition of unmet need is never as clear cut as you think it might be when you actually come to put an argument down on paper. So it will be interesting to see what comes out around the kind of meat and bones of it.
Now, I will say one thing that he said in there that I had this moment like I feel heard, right? He said sometimes it would just be so easy to pick up the phone, have a 15-minute discussion with your FDA disciplinary reviewers. And I'll tell you, 6, 8, 10 years ago, I would try and send an email to FDA and they would say, you know what? You are not in this very specific box on this very specific form. So we can't talk to you. Now, just thinking, can I get on the phone, get a quick answer, help really not be bound by some timeline for holding a formal meeting instead of a phone call or something like that. Again, this is perhaps aspirational on part of FDA. We will have to see what it actually means. But if there is some teeth to that, I think that would be very helpful. Again, I think we've all been in this position where you just want to be like, I got to throw up the bat signal to the FDA reviewer and just see, can we get them on the horn for a few minutes? And on this very specific issue, get some feedback.
And certainly, I think regulators have gone full circle over the years. I was lamenting with someone the other day about the days when I could pick up the phone and actually speak to a rapporteur in Europe during review. And then a few years ago, people started misusing, if you like, started abusing that possibility. And rapporteurs were getting phoned about things, procedural things, stuff that they didn't really want to speak about in that forum. And actually, in the end, the EMA have ended up being something of a barrier that controls that communication, which for those really time-bound things, I think has been to the detriment of both sides, actually, but I completely understand that. So I think whenever those direct communication paths are opened up, it then has to be used really sensibly by all concerned to make sure it is about the things that are really going to make a difference to the patients at the end of the day, not just to the commercial aspirations of a company, the things that really, really do matter in terms of the development of that molecule.
Yeah, and I don't think hopefully it would change any regulatory decision making, but you definitely don't want to be the sponsor who cried wolf in this scenario.
No, you do not want to be the sponsor who cried wolf. There's always a reputational piece to all of these interactions, isn't there? So that is everything I had on my list, Eric. Is there anything else, anything that's happened in the last week or so, anything else at this point you feel we should touch on?
Not really. I think these were the big ones. Again, this has only been in the 3 months since our Crystal Ball podcast. So that is quite a lot of fun.
We have to do this on a quarterly basis.
Yeah, I'm going to put something on the Outlook calendar, catch up with Katherine, FDA updates, and maybe go from there. Again, I think we've seen some steps in the right direction. We're seeing some new stakeholders. We're going to see the practical outputs from these stakeholders, from these programs. I guess cautiously optimistic at this point with some of this stuff. And honestly, I think that's better than the alternative. I'm just going to keep proceeding like things are going to go the way they have been or potentially better with some of what's being instituted. If and when we see changes, we will take note of them. If it begins to happen as more of like an N of 3 or 4 or 5 instead of an N of 1, then we'll say, okay, maybe this is changing a little bit. But for now, I think we're just going to sort of take it at face value, know that there's going to be additional granularity coming downstream, and we're just going to keep doing the same due diligence I think we've been.
Totally agree. And if there are new updates, anything really important that comes through, we will always do our best to keep you informed of those things, as well as the reality on the ground as we're seeing it. I think in that case, Eric, all that remains is for me to say thank you so much for your time and for the conversation and your insights today. And let's keep an eye on what happens over the next few months and keep everyone updated.
Yes, I will see you again at the end of September when we discuss the next 3 months.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Eric. Bye-bye.
Hey, thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Conversations in Drug Development, the podcast series brought to you by the team at Boyd's. Don't forget to follow us on the usual podcast platforms or visit our website to ensure you don't miss out on any of our future episodes.